Morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. Look at this huge crowd. Wow. Well, you know what? Many people have asked me, why this project? I have absolutely no musical skill whatsoever. If I do, I absolutely have not cultivated it. Ask my family, they know that. I have never sung in a choir, except for Sunday school choir when I was like yay high. And you know what? I never even really had an urge to even sing in a choir. But I love the sound that choirs produce. And so the question remains, why this project? The answer is twofold. I love music. Music, according to one of my participants, is joyful, it's sober, it's reflective, solemn. It's anguished, it's sad, it's despairing, it's depressing, or it's uplifting. That is what music is. And these are the reasons that I love music, and likely the reasons that all of you love music too. It speaks to the very core of our being, like nothing else can. The other thing is, I'm curious. I'm curious about the ways that God operates in our world. I'm curious about the ways God operates in our cities, and in our neighborhoods, and in our communities. And you know what? I'm also curious about spirituality. It's a buzzword today. It is cool to be spiritual. But you know what? The term is amorphous. It means different things to different people. And in recent years, there has been remarkable growth in the area of spirituality. Maybe the growing cynicism toward material possessions is leading to more attention being paid to the spiritual dimensions of life. The discovery that personal spirituality has a positive therapeutic effect on individuals points to the importance one's spirituality has on human fulfillment and well-being. Put that beside a gradual decline in interest of institutionalized forms of religion in Western culture, and we see a clear rise in popular interest in spirituality. And as such, we have before us today a spiritual buffet, so to speak, right? So when I had a conversation almost 2 years ago now about community choirs with one of my student colleagues, something inside me went, aha, this might be a really great grad project. As a future minister of the United Church of Canada, I became more and more curious about what is happening when people sing together. My imagination started spinning, and as a result, I set out on a quest to seek to understand the ways the Holy Spirit is using music and collective voice as a vehicle to influence people in our communities. The question that has underpinned my research graduate project the last 7 months is, how does the experience of singing in community choir influence one's spirituality? I subscribe to a social constructivism philosophical assumption, which means I simply seek to understand the world in which my participants live and work, and I interpret my participants' construction of meaning as such. I use the phenomenological methodology to guide my research process. This process is about capturing the essence of a lived experience as shared among the participants. My participants came from 2 different community choirs. Both choirs have no particular reason to gather, except that they love and they share a love of singing. I sent an email to both choir directors, who were very helpful in finding possible participants. I went to each of the choir practices, I identified myself to the group, and I received a very warm welcome from both choirs. Folks who wanted to participate either came forward to speak personally while I was at the choir practice, and others sent me an email saying they wanted to contribute. I interviewed 8 participants in total, 4 participants from each choir. I interviewed 2 males and 6 females. I audio recorded all of my interviews and transcribed them all. All interviews took place in one of 3 places: participants' homes, coffee shops, church sanctuaries. In order to preserve anonymity, I used a random name generator to name my participants, and these are the names that I came up with. We can't nail down a specific definition of spirituality. It seems we can't control it. Maybe we're not supposed to control it. So where does one start? I started with the literature, and then I asked my participants, then I considered my own working definition. Because I found a gap in the literature, I looked for aspects of spirituality around singing in community choirs. Most writers in the literature agree that true spirituality includes a social dimension. Historically, the term spiritual was first coined by St. Paul to describe that which pertained to the Holy Spirit. But while the Christian origins of the term are absolutely clear, that does not mean we ought to be blinded by the reality of other spiritualities. Ken Collins writes that an atheist might lose herself or himself in some lofty goal or purpose, experience transcendence as well as a measure of integration, thereby developing a genuine spirituality broadly understood. A theistic spirituality will experience the transcendent as a personal God, as expressed in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Jay McQuarrie explores spirituality in terms of what it means to be a human being. Spirituality, he says, has to do with becoming a person in the fullest sense of the word. And Diana Butler Bass describes it this way. Spirituality is not just about sitting in a room encountering a mystical God in meditation or seeing God in a sunset. It is a deep awareness that we are creators who work with the Creator in an ongoing project of crafting the world. With respect to music and spirituality, I found Ruth Wills, and she says music is a way to enable individuals to fulfill their innate spiritual potential and experience transcendence, noting that spirituality emerges from common human experiences. And a music therapist in Africa speaks of community choirs as she writes what she has experienced. She says she's experienced exhilarating public combustions when we have all by magic become as one, moving and being moved together by music that seemed to enter our bones and collect us, just in spite of ourselves, as one society celebrating itself. When I asked my participants if they might describe what spirituality means to them, some of the responses were, spirituality is connection with other people. It's everywhere. It's not just internal, but external too. That's what Lily said. Lewis says that spirituality is not something you can acquire. You are born with it, and you have to nurture it. And if you don't nurture it, it will wither. Charlie talked about spirituality this way. He said spirituality for him is seeking to be present, connecting myself and my soul with others in the natural world to understand and gain comfort in this life. And my personal favorite, spirituality is supposed to be an expression of a contact with God, Ella says. I would say I'm a spiritual person, meaning I'm someone who thinks maybe there's something else out there. Maybe it's Star Trek. Maybe it's the Force. Or maybe it's Jesus. But not the church Jesus. Something greater than myself, she said. No idea. Now we can smile and laugh at that last interpretation because it is funny, but there is also a depth to that last response. Right, church? Those of us who love church know there are truth in those words. So friends, we can really see how amorphous the term spirituality really is. It's also important to know what my working definition is of spirituality. And so spirituality for me is absolutely grounded in the incarnation of Jesus Christ and the role that the Trinity plays in that. It is part of who I am. And what does that mean? It means that my connection to God is inherently first connected to the work of the Holy Spirit, which means that any spiritual connection for me will point to Jesus Christ. If I don't see Jesus in the face of the other, and if I don't recognize Jesus in the midst of the messy ordinariness of daily living, And if I don't connect with and be an authentic community where humility and justice and healing is being sought and served, my spirituality is not being nurtured, and I won't flourish to the fullness of my God-given gifts. And that, friends, brings me to how I've situated my project in a theological framework. I want to briefly review a little bit with you about incarnation theology and the notion of beauty as a road travel to God from different theologians and scholars before moving into what my participants had to say, because it's relevant to how I interpreted my data. As Christians, we have an innate spiritual desire to touch an invisible and intangible God in some tangible way. Alistair McGrath writes, Jesus Christ allows us to see God in the flesh as one who can be seen and heard and felt. McGrath says the idea of the incarnation simply means God taking on human flesh, undergoing the voluntary process of humiliation to enter into human history and take on the entire experience of existence as a human being. Pope Benedict affirms beauty as a pathway to God and draws upon Plato, who further describes the experience of beauty, teaching that the dominant effect of beauty is to give us a healthy shock that draws us out of ourselves and the rut in which we sometimes find ourselves entrenched throughout our daily routine. Beauty gives us wings, lifting us up so that we may soar to the transcendent and rise to greatness. John of Damascus, an 8th century monk, also dwells on the value of beauty and matter in his argument that the incarnation of Christ provides a solid foundation for the use of icons in devotion. John of Damascus works toward the idea that God's self-giving is constant because of the incarnation, and things in the world are participating in God's self-giving. He says that by meditating on the artwork, one's gaze can pass through the artwork to see God, thereby becoming incarnated by participating in the beauty that is the life of God, therefore being transformed in that moment. The same might be said in terms of music. While the argument could be that contemporary music is in itself idolatrous by nurturing self-gratification and a sense of entitlement over God, I think if we have the ears to see and the eyes to see it, it could be easily within the realm of possibility that choral music sung in community, as we see it today, might be iconic, leading one into an encounter with the divine that is transformative in nature. If it is probable that one can encounter God by meditating on art, then why isn't it probable that singing in community choirs can take the hearers past the songs to encounter the God who is beauty? In their book, Singing Meditation, Together in Sound and Silence, Ruthie Rosier and Liz Hill write that the act of singing strengthens the community and the group's camaraderie, enhancing the beauty and power of the songs. They go on to say that group singing is much more about interaction, energy, and blending between us, and hopefully this leads to a movement towards the divine. Music, then, to use David Dean's words, can be literally beautiful in that it can be literally God-filled, not as a metaphor, but as a logical representation and participation in that beauty. Exploring how the lived experience of singing in a community choir can influence one's spirituality is how I seek to understand this phenomenon. And with these things in mind, let us now turn to what our participants had to say. I discovered 6 themes of what I would consider aspects of spirituality in my data. And I will explore 3 of them with you today: transcendence, purpose, and struggle. The notion of transcendence was a very clear theme that came through in my interviews. I recalled Kathleen Harmon's words after my interview with Charlie at a downtown coffee shop. Harmon says that when the sound is heard is voice, The interiority is personal. For the spoken word proceeds from the human interior and manifests human beings to one another as conscious interiors. Likewise, Charlie described his sense of transcendence in terms of presence. There is definitely energy in the room, he said, and it fills my desire to be present. We are focused on singing together, so we are all trying to be present. I think afterwards, the benefit of going and singing is not just singing yourself, but singing with others. It opens a different portal into one's life. For Charlie, it seems the act of singing with other people seems to take him to a different level where he can hold space together in terms of connection, whether that's a spiritual connection or singing together, however that might manifest for him. I was reminded of Hildegard of Bingen as I listened to my next three participants. Bingen was a 12th century poetess, musician, artist, healer, scientist, theologian, prophet, and mystic. She absolutely insists on harmony and humility in her singing because they must subordinate their desire for power, for self-assertion, to the common good. Is that not an example of Christ being incarnated in our midst? Not thinking more of oneself than one ought to is a Christ-like act. For Bingen, when harmony and humility are at play, the sound then, through the operation of the Holy Spirit, becomes beautiful like Christ, who makes things beautiful. Ella described that harmonic sound as the sweet spot. Lily said, I notice that sometimes when you are singing, you don't even feel that it's coming out of you. You know what I mean? That's the best moment because it's also coming out of everybody else. You don't hear it yourself, you hear the group. So to me, that's a really cool experience because it gets you out of your ego and you just become part of that group. Later in the interview, she put it this way: there are moments when you are feeling like it's not even coming out of your mouth, but coming out of your pores, and there is this sense of one. Molly, who has sang in both church choirs and community choirs, shared this same sense of transcendence. Describing her spirituality this way, she said, I recognize I'm one in this huge body, but at the same time, that huge body is me. I'm part of it, and it's part of me. And all the rhetoric falls away. She went on to share that same aha moment in the community choir. Sometimes there are these moments when we take a new song, and we work it, and we work it, and we work it, and we all did our part, and all of a sudden, it was just like it meshed. Everything melted, and you were there. Here we are. It's amazing. Ella grew up with lots of music, but she realized after retirement she had an urge to join a community choir. She shared her sense of transcendence like this: I find the choir more of a moment. It gives me great happiness, especially when you hear other voices harmonizing around you. It does something inside you. You know that in a couple of lines you're going to get to some crunch crescendo when this voice or that voice are going to come together, and it's going to do that vibration thing, and I go, let me die. It's that crunch sound in your heart that makes you just... There are a few songs like that, she said. All three of these participants spoke of either getting out of their ego in some way and becoming part of that group, hearing the harmony around them and in them and through them, and in that moment, everything dissolves and they are there. Looking through the lens of the incarnation, I would argue that these three participants have experienced something of the divine and possibly have participated in God's self-giving love toward them in those moments. Phoebe described her sense of transcendence as inner movement. There is something special about music. There's another dimension to it. There's something that's spiritual. There is something about the words and the music of certain songs that really sink in, or something. They become more moving, something moving in your spirit, moving your feelings, and when you sing them, it's a deep and moving feeling, I think. She went on to say that it can happen with non-worship songs because the words have meaning. And that includes a lot of different songs. But singing about ending war, for me, that's really big. Phoebe remembers World War II, and for her, if the lyrics have meaning, they hold the possibility of taking her to another dimension that is transcendent and something beyond herself. My next theme I want to talk with you about is purpose. Diana Butler Bass acknowledges a sense of purpose and spirituality. More than half of my participants in these two community choirs have a deep awareness of crafting a world that includes beauty and purpose through their choirs. One person was very resistant to the idea of spirituality being influenced by singing in a choir. For Lewis, there was absolutely no connection between his spirituality and singing in community choir at all. Zero, none whatsoever. However, upon further reflection of Lewis's words, and in light of Diana Butler Bass's description of spirituality, I want to say that Lewis has a deep and profound spirituality that singing in community choirs has for him. And I think it is a way for him to use his gifts in crafting a world of beauty in partnership with his Creator. Lewis has been singing in choir since he was 10, and he shares that when he joins a choir or goes to a new church, he asks himself, would I enjoy being in that choir? And can I make a contribution to that choir? He goes on to say that I enjoy singing, I enjoy choirs, I just enjoy it. It doesn't matter how many are in the choir, I just enjoy the singing. It's the molding of something, you know. It's taking something that is raw material and turning that something into something beautiful. Later in the interview, Lewis said, I don't go to choir in anticipation of getting a warm, fuzzy feeling about my church. I am there to sing, and I am there to sing as well as I can and to make a contribution to the good of the choir. You learn something every time you attend, he said, and when I leave choir practice, I drive home and I am fulfilled. In similar fashion, Ella says, the choir is purpose for me, you know, a sense of accomplishment. The choir has become my volunteer thing, she shared as she prepares the sanctuary for their weekly gathering. I've taken the time to come much earlier. I take care of the music, and if anything needs copying, I'll do that. I'm in charge of welcoming people, so I open up the front doors to let them in. I turn on the lights. So that gives me a good feeling of some kind of purpose. I feel like sometimes the things you do, and you don't really know why you do them. You just do them because they bring you joy, fulfillment, and purpose. Sheena shared how a sense of purpose is an aspect of community choir that influences her spirituality. Because it's a community and you are there for a common purpose, which is to enjoy the music, to enjoy the voice, and to enjoy the gift you have been given, you recognize that gift in the people around you, and it makes you cooperative. So we sing like this. We lean into each other so that she can hear me. And then sometimes I kind of lean over to the other side because this gal over here, she's really got it. So then I can say, okay, I can come here and do this, you know. So I think it brings people together for something that is good, and it brings people together for a common purpose. Sheena's sense of purpose is expressed in terms of the common goal of the choir, which is to make a joyful noise. One could say that creating a joyful noise in partnership with the Creator is participating in the divine, perhaps even being transformed and incarnated in that moment. Charlie described his sense of purpose as an expression of identity. The choir is people who want to sing together. He continued, I think of British soccer, actually, and a lot of the coaches are asked, what do you ask of your team? And they go, well, I just tell them to go out there and express themselves on the field. And I think the choir is allowing all of us to go there and express ourselves collectively and individually, I guess. And really, to me, it means being present, because you get caught up in you lost 2 games and you were trying to win another one. And the reality is you just need to get out there and be present to the game. I really think it's a good goal in general, he said. For Gertrude, singing in the community choir is an avenue to let her spirituality out, and her sense of purpose flows from that. For Gertrude, not only does she love to sing for the sake of singing, her spirituality seems to be something that she gives away to make the world a better place. Singing in community is her expression of that. She says, "We are not a performance choir, so any worry about performance just goes away, and you just sing your best to them." A sense of purpose, then, however that is manifested, is a genuine fruit of spirituality, and people experience that in community choirs. The third theme I want to talk to you today about is struggle. This theme quantitatively ranked last in terms of how many times it was spoken to. In qualitative research, however, that doesn't negate its importance in the research. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the theme of struggle that I perceived in the data. And to consider this, we need to think about what a community choir is. Sheena captures it best in this description. The community choir is an entity in and of itself. It is very representative to the community which draws the people. You have all socioeconomic groups, all education groups. You have young and old and everyone in between. You have new moms and grandmoms and granddads and such. You have blue collar and very professional, retired and unemployed. It's a reflection of the community itself. This, for me, clarifies the diversity that is indeed a community choir. It is almost a microcosm of the church, if not the entire global community. Those of us who live in community in some way, shape, or form recognize that struggle is part of our spiritual growth, it's part of our humanity, and it's part of who we are. The same can be said for community choirs. John Bell, for instance, has no illusions when it comes to the acts of singing together. In his book, The Singing Thing, he makes careful note that we bring all of ourselves to the music, our childhood, our adolescence, our cultural and political sensitivities, and all the associations and memories that they engender. We are equally creatures of our conditioning, and to distinguish between one and the other requires sometimes honesty, sometimes integrity, and sometimes humble heroism. Recognizing these things about community, I felt it was important to ask my participants if they had experienced any bumps along the road while participating in community choir. We all have our baggage that we bring to things, so I wanted to more clearly present the realities that come when people gather in community. All of my participants, except one, spoke of some struggles, but none of these would ever outweigh the benefits that their community choir brings to them. The struggles people spoke of were internal and external in nature. Sheena says, "There are always struggles in any community, regardless of what it is you are doing. You have to remember that people are there because they love what they are doing just as much as you do. The talent, the musical knowledge, the ability to read is all over the map. There are always people who never quite get it at all, and there is always somebody who gets it quicker than everybody else. And so we struggle together. We lean into each other and we listen." Sheena continued, "I hear the music in my head, but that does not mean that my voice will be able to reproduce it. I mean, I have some beside me who read eloquently but can't sing, and some who can sing beautifully but can't read music. You can't judge anybody because they can't read music." Echoing Sheena's thoughts on the matter, Lily expressed it like this: "When you sit beside the person that sings off key, that's the bump, really." She continued, "You learn it is my problem, or it is her problem, and it is my problem, and I can choose to accept it, fight it, be in a bad mood about it." Phoebe is one who likes to sing, but she feels she'd be one of those folks who might sing off key. She said, "Yeah, it's kind of complex, you know. There are those who are beautiful singers, and then you have the rest of us. Many of us who are there, are there just because we like to sing. We like the music and we like the fellowship. But really, I think everyone is just happy to have good singers among us because they all help us learn. The act of singing was identified as key to navigating through struggle. Learning to listen is part of the struggle and part of the influence community choir has on people's spirituality. Ella shared that singing in community choir improves my ability to listen to what's around me. And similarly, Sheena said the same thing. Listening is probably the most important thing. We yatter back and forth, and we hear, but we don't always listen. In music, you really have to listen to the people around you to know where you are on the page and where you need to come. You have to listen, and that's probably the most important thing you can learn. I also try to reflect that in my everyday life, she said. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not. Some of my participants experience the struggle in ways that don't necessarily relate to their neighbor. Perhaps it's more of an inner struggle. For example, Charlie finds it challenging to read the notes and identify the pattern in the song. And later in his interview, he said, there is vulnerability in singing in public. So overcoming that vulnerability or experiencing it, it's kind of allowing you to manifest that in whatever way that is for you, and probably in others. Molly, on the other hand, gives a lot of credit to church choirs as they nurtured her gift in singing. As a result, her biggest struggle came when she was forced to choose between her church choir and community choir due to a practice conflict. After a period of reflection, she said she felt nudged to choose the community choir. She couldn't really explain her decision beyond that nudging, but after some time she thought, maybe the church choir gets a little stale because you're dealing with the same personalities all the time. A few of my participants mentioned their resistance to new songs, which is really just a symptom of our human nature to resist change. Ella's response to this part of the struggle was, at first you go, oh, I'm not sure about that. But then 2 weeks later, it's your most favorite song on earth. Phoebe also talked about her resistance to new music. I like to sing things I know rather than things I don't. I love to sing hymns, things that are really familiar. The struggles described in this research project are universal to the human condition. And I think if it wasn't for the struggles, the opportunity for personal and collective growth might be lost. So why does all of this matter? Of course, there are limits to any research, and this research has a very small participant sample. But it does cause me pause to consider the things in terms of what it means for the church. How do church choirs experience the holy? Do church choirs feel the same way as my participants do? What is the role of the church choir today with the growing popularity of community choirs? Maybe it remains unchanged, but maybe there are new ways for church choirs to reach out to their communities. One thing we all know is that the church is being led to a new place. Vincent Donovan, author of Rediscovering Christianity, says 2 things need to come together to lead us to that new place: the gospel and the sacred arena of people's lives. And I can tell you from my lived experience of researching this project that community choirs are indeed sacred arenas of people's lives. While listening to one of my participating choirs sing Oscar Hammerstein's A Few of My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music, I'll tell you a story here. I kind of felt like Jesus or the Spirit or something quietly grabbed my spirit inside and said, I'm about to show you some of my favorite things. And you know what? I felt like the gospel was already there, dancing and swirling about. It didn't seem to matter whether or not the people identified it as such. I heard stories of healing, comfort, and joy. I heard stories of how the sheer power of our collective voices gathered together impact our heart and our mind and our soul. And I heard stories of purpose and of people coming out of their comfort zones to sing together. Stories of relationship and acceptance and struggle and hospitality all rolled into one. I just feel that there is a new thing on the horizon, and I think if we have the ears to hear and the eyes to see it, maybe we will perceive it. Amen. Thank you.
Well, lots there. Wow. Wow, what a timely project. Thank you for sharing it with us. We have a decent amount of time, about 20 minutes, for questions, for comments, for conversation, and I have this is the mic, the talking stick as it would be. If anyone would like to ask a question or share a comment.
Thank you, Angela. It was wonderful. I would like you to talk a little bit about your theological framework for the project, because I didn't really get that out of the presentation. So.
Oh, you didn't get the theological framework?
No.
So the theological framework was set within the doctrine of the incarnation, okay? And so what that simply means is that God deciding to join humanity and walk through humanity's experience in and through the person of Jesus Christ. So walking through the muddiness of life and just being there all the time. Sometimes we recognize that, sometimes we don't. And so that combined with St. John of Damascus, he argued that because of the incarnation, that the using icons or art for beauty as a way of seeing through them to experience the presence of God, that works, because before Jesus, before the incarnation, that would have been seen as very idolatrous in the Hebrew Testament, right? So St. John of Damascus' argument is that, if we can look through art, icons, any kind of thing like that, that is beautiful, to see through to the God who is beauty, then we will be participating in that life of God in that way.
Thank you so very much. Use the caption. All sound communicates presence. And all through your presentation, I felt that it was all-encompassing. It's almost like you were just not saying that the choir was the sound, but the sound was in the choir.
Right.
Can you speak to us some more about that all-encompassing thing that you discovered through your research?
Yeah, well, I can speak to it from what my participants have said that they experienced. And so what happens is, from what my participants say, is that when they come to gather to sing in music and in choir, you come as the individual and you bring yourself to that. And so, but what happens is when the voices start working together, there's this sense of just everything melting into one. And I think one person put it, you kind of even lose your ego. You kind of get out of the way and you just sort of you just be there in that moment. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but.
Hi, Angela. Thank
Hi,
you. I'm really curious. You mentioned one person in your group who had to choose between church and so that person obviously had a relationship with church.
Yes.
I'm wondering about your other participants and their relationship to church, and whether or not that was a factor in choosing the people that you chose.
No, that was not a factor. I didn't know who was coming to see me. I just randomly picked them. I did not know whether they were Christian or they identified as some other form of faith. I can tell you that 5 out of the 8 participants identified as Christian. The other 3 did not. And, for the ones that were identified themselves as Christian, that was just one particular person who shared that experience with her. I don't know if anybody else had to come up upon that situation, whether they had to choose between church, choir, and community choir, what their response would have been to that. It would be interesting to find out. But the other participants, they had, it didn't seem to come up as an issue.
Did you have an experience of the people who are related to church somehow having different language that they used in their conversations with you than the people who aren't in church?
Can you say more about that? different language?
I'm curious about whether or not the people who have a relationship with church had language that the other people didn't have in order to express their experience in worship and in music in their community choir.
I hadn't actually thought about that aspect of it, but yeah, you're probably right. I mean, there was one person in particular. She was very well versed in church language and was able to speak to her experience in church choirs. I mean, she sang in choirs all her life, church and community choirs, right? So her words were very, very much well versed in church language and non-church language. The other participants who didn't identify as Christian, there was no church language that came out of their interviews.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
No.
Anyone else have a question or comment?
I think this is appropriate. I had the experience myself in my first year here at AST to be part of a community choir, which so many people wanted to join as it got larger and larger that they had to, some of the churches in the neighborhood had to change their date because the community choir was becoming so popular. So they certainly interact.
Huh. Interesting. Thank you, Mavis.
So thanks so much for a great presentation. Were you able to explore whether the content of the music, in terms of its lyrics or meaning, matters at all?
Yeah.
And I can think of just a couple examples. In the church that I go to, there's a choir where some people participate in the rest of the service and others don't.
Right.
And I think that's fairly common.
Yeah.
I also joined a community choir where the director said, look, you don't have to believe any of this stuff because we're singing sacred music, but just look like you believe it. And I feel like that's a compromise that directors have to come to. So I just want, and I know that I'm singing in this group with people who are atheists and agnostics and of other faiths and so on, and yet we're singing currently, then shall I teach your ways unto the wicked from Psalm 51, and I think, why are we singing this?
Yep. Do you know what? That in that way, some people that didn't really bother them at all. They were more. It seemed like it was more of the connection to the community, and it didn't really seem to matter. If they were singing sacred religious songs. There were a few people who did say the lyrics do matter to them, whether or not it's worship or songs you would hear on the radio. As long as the words had meaning for them, then that had the possibility of bringing them into this sense of transcendence that you heard about in this presentation. So, as far as people of other faiths coming to a community choir and then you end up singing, say, some kind of religious music, I had one of my participants say she doesn't really ascribe to Christianity per se, but she would say, this is really religious, but I still love it. It's really interesting. Yeah.
So I'm going to take the long way.
I was just wondering, you had said something about the church needing to perhaps take a look at where we're going in terms of perhaps taking a lesson from community choirs. Could you speak a little more? Do you have any ideas?
I have
doing this?
No ideas per se, only by looking at what's happening in the community. I mean, there is obviously a growing trend in popularity in community choirs, and they are feeding some kind of something for people, whether that is in terms of connection or a spiritual connection or just really wanting to sing with others. And so I just kind of thought, well, you know what? We all know things are changing in the church, and they're changing pretty darn quick. And so today, it's curious to think about how could the community choirs maybe reach out to their communities? It's just things rolling in my head. I don't have this particular idea in mind, but it's just something to think about, I think. It's a good question, Debbie. Thank you. There's somebody behind you there.
Thank you.
On that topic, I thank you very much, by the way, for a wonderful presentation and a very inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
So were both the community choirs that you the people from the city, were they metro-based?
Some were, and some were not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So how small was the community where they weren't metro-based?
One would be, I would probably call it a little bit more rural, and one would definitely be urban-based. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So not to sidetrack, but I'm in a parish outside of the city.
Okay.
And I would say that one of the things that I've been thinking about as you've been presenting is how choir, in this case church-based, has the power to heal. And so that's something that just really has come up for me in this. And just very briefly, in the setting that I'm in, we have a wonderful organist, but he's off in the winter. So we've had to scrounge for different ways of having music. And
Right.
what's happened is we are led during the winter by a couple who one plays the guitar and the other plays the concertina.
Wonderful.
So that's for our Sunday mornings.
Okay.
But this year, for the first time, we decided to see if we could cobble together what we call an Easter choir, which, because we tend to have theme choirs, because, you know, the process in and having to sit at the front in gowns
Right.
and whatnot is very intimidating for
Yes,
people.
that's right.
And they can't commit to a year-round kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
So we've had 16 people come out. They're all somehow church connected, but many of them have never, ever, 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 ever considered the choir. Maybe when they were kids, but as adults, I've never seen them in the choir. And maybe because it's my 11th year there, I got up the nerve to ask people who I knew were suffering from depression or lost a spouse and
That's
just,
right.
you know, it's a safe way to come out in the evening in the winter, in the
Yeah.
darkest time of the year,
Yeah.
and they are loving it.
They're loving it.
And
yeah.
there's a kind of personal healing and a smiling and a connecting, but also we have two churches, and part of the requirements for coming to this particular choir is that even though most of the people go to the big church, we are also a mission to the little church at 9 a.m. on Easter Sunday morning.
Oh,
So
okay.
there's a
There's an
healing
overlap
there
there.
that's
Yes.
happening within the community. So I just wanted to mention that because I have a lot of hope for music in the church as well as in the community.
Yeah, that's right.
And we didn't say you have to belong to the church to come. In fact, I said, bring your friends, you know, and but they brought their friends from within the church community this time. But I see kind of an opportunity for spiraling another year from now.
Yeah.
So I hope you don't mind me. I hope that didn't go sideways too much for you.
No, it didn't go sideways at all. In
Yeah.
fact, that was one of the themes that came out in the community choirs too, was the aspect of healing and comfort and really compassion that the group members receive from one another. It's you can't underestimate that. And I didn't, you know, I think there's hope for the church. There's also hope for the church choirs as well.
Yeah.
I just think in this time and age and era that we're in, it's things are changing a little bit. Like you say, people have never thought about church choirs, but they come in and they sing. And so maybe there's a shift, maybe there's a paradigm shift happening there.
It's
maybe
kind
what
of a
people
community. Yeah, it's a community of friends wanting
That's
to,
right.
as you say, blend their voices and their
Exactly.
time. Thank
Yeah.
you so much.
Thank you.
I think you've inspired
Thank
me
you
to
for the
write my
question.
Easter homily.
Yes, great presentation, Angela.
Thanks, Shannon.
I am part of a choir. Actually, Heather's part of it with me.
Oh.
It's an inclusion choir. And so about 50% of the people have intellectual disabilities who are in the choir.
Wonderful.
And we might be like the worst sounding choir in the world, which is good because that's the only kind of choir I would be in. And so what I'm curious about, though, is if you were able to tease away the difference between the part, you know, the spirituality of community
Yeah.
and the spirituality of singing. because I can see that coming together in community is actually a really wonderful thing. And as our choir does, lots of the folks there also are on Special Olympics together, or they get together for various different dances or whatever. And I see a difference in the choir than I do in those other events,
Right.
which is interesting, particularly the bridge that it causes between people who have intellectual disabilities and those who don't. I think that it's an equalizer.
For sure.
And so I'm just curious if you found any distinction between the community aspect and then specifically the fact that they are gathering to sing.
Well, that was a lot of their motivation, was specifically to gather to sing. I heard that over and over again. They come together to sing because they enjoy singing. They enjoy singing and they enjoy the people. That's one person actually told me about that. She said, really, for me, it's all about the people. It's getting to know the people. And then she said, she qualified that. She said, in truth, as somebody who has moved around the country for many years, getting to be known for her was a really important part of the community choir aspect. And there were couple of writers I mentioned there in the beginning who spoke to that exact thing that you're talking about, which is the spirituality of singing. And, it really nurtures the innate spirituality that is in everybody, no matter what. And there was people who said, what did they say? They feel uplifted. They cannot believe, it's almost even after the fact. For some of them, it wasn't even during the choir. It was after the fact. When they walk away, they're on another plane. They're feeling better. Doesn't matter what happened during the day. Yeah, it is.
All right, we have time for one more question. No pressure.
Okay. It's not a question per se, but an observation. When you sing in a choir, and I'm a choral director, when you sing in a choir and you take away the instruments and it's just the voices blending together and singing in harmony, and when you take away that instrument, you take away a wall that you can hide behind, so that when you are just your voices, it is such exposure. But when you meld those voices together and you sing and you blend, and all that energy is just coming together as one, it's an incredible experience, both as a director and as a singer as well. So, yeah.
And that came out a lot in my interviews, for sure. Thank you, Martha.
Great. Well, let's give another round of applause to Angela for her great presentation.